Welcome to a deep dive into some of Earth's, well, most hidden and mysterious environments. Just try to imagine a world beneath miles, literally miles, of ice.
A realm of liquid water, yeah, but also total darkness and extreme pressure. For decades, scientists have been, captivated by the possibility of life somehow thriving in these conditions. And honestly, what they found is truly astounding. Yeah, we're talking about subglacial lakes. These are basically bodies of liquid water trapped under massive ice sheets and glaciers. Often they've been isolated, completely cut off from the surface for millennia. And this isn't just about, exploring weird, hidden parts of our own planet. It actually offers pretty profound insights into how life might exist elsewhere, say on icy moons in the outer solar system. So today we're going to unpack the incredible journey of their discovery, their really unique characteristics, the, frankly, surprising life forms they harbor, and some of the latest groundbreaking research that's, well, reshaping how we understand them.
And we've got a fascinating stack of sources for this deep dive, everything from historical accounts right up to cutting-edge scientific papers. It's all tailored to give you a shortcut to being, well, pretty well informed on these incredible hidden worlds. So, let's get started. It's actually quite remarkable when you think about it that the idea of liquid water under miles of ice isn't even new. It goes back to the late 19th century. Who were the first people to even, I guess, dare to imagine such a thing?
Well, it seems to have started with Peter Kropotkin, a Russian scientist. He first proposed the idea, suggesting that geothermal heating, heat coming up from deep within the Earth, could actually melt the ice from the bottom up. And this was sort of echoed later by Igor Zotykov, another Russian glaciologist. He theorized about Antarctic ice shrinking because of this basal melting. So the theoretical groundwork was definitely there. But getting direct evidence, that took quite a bit longer.
That's an incredible leap, though. Going from theory to actually finding something beneath all that ice. How did they first manage that? Were sound waves involved somehow?
Exactly. The first major step came with systematic surveys. In the late 1950s, early 60s, a Russian geographer, Andrei Kapitsa, used seismic sounding. This was near Vostok Station in Antarctica.
Okay.
Basically, yeah, sending sound waves down through the ice and listening for how they bounce back off whatever was underneath. That initial data, it wasn't even specifically looking for lakes at first, more just mapping the bedrock. But decades later, that same data was re-examined, and boom, it led directly to identifying Lake Vostok as a massive subglacial lake.
Okay, so sound waves gave the first hint. But that sounds a bit hit or miss. How did scientists get a more, systematic way to detect these hidden lakes?
Right, that needed something more consistent. And what turned out to be pivotal was work by two English physicists, Stan Evans and Gordon Robin. They developed this technique called radioglaciology, specifically radio echo sounding, or RES. This was also in the late 1950s.
RES, like radar for ice.
Pretty much. Think of it like a giant ultrasound for glaciers. They send radio waves down through the ice and listen for the echoes bouncing back from the base.
Yeah.
And they figured out that subglacial lakes have this really distinct signature in the RES data. You get an exceptionally strong reflection right off the ice base.
Stronger than rock.
Much stronger.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly constant, indicating a very smooth surface. And flat, really flat slopes, less than 1%. Water just reflects radio waves differently, much more efficiently than rock or sediment. So this RES method, it was a total game changer. Between 1971 and 1979, there was this big US, UK, Danish collaboration using RES. They mapped huge parts of East and West Antarctica. And that's when they started revealing not just isolated lakes, but also discovering that some of these subglacial systems seem to be interconnected.
Wow. Okay, so after the theory and the early soundings, you got RES mapping things out. How did technology then let us kind of confirm what was happening from, well, way up high without even setting foot on the ice?
That's where satellites came into play. In the early 1990s, the European ERS-1 satellite used its radar altimeter. It could detect these incredibly flat surfaces over large areas, like the northern boundary of Lake Vostok. So that helped map out lake distribution from space. It was amazing confirmation.
Okay, so mapping the flatness?
Yeah, but then it got even more dynamic. In 2005, data from RadarSat, another satellite, showed the actual surface ice above some areas slumping down, and in other places, bulging up slightly over time.
The ice itself was moving.
Exactly. It indicated these active subglacial lakes were literally filling and emptying beneath the ice. That proved they weren't just static features, they were alive in a hydrological sense. And then between about 2003 and 2009, NASA's IceSat satellite, using lasers this time for super precise elevation measurements, it produced the first continental scale map of these active lakes across Antarctica, identified 124 of them. Lake Cook, for instance, was singled out as being particularly active, hydrologically speaking.
That realization that these lakes weren't static, but interconnected and dynamic. Wow, that must have completely changed the picture. But even knowing all that from remote sensing, I imagine trying to actually get a sample to drill down there must have presented entirely new, unique challenges.
Oh, absolutely. A whole new level of difficulty. The biggest challenge by far was contamination. And you're talking about potentially pristine environments, isolated for maybe millions of years, maybe harboring unique or ancient life. The last thing you want to do is introduce surface microbes or, drilling fluids.
Right, you'd ruin the very thing you're trying to study.
Precisely. So this led to some serious international discussions. There was a big conference in 2010, and then the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting in 2011 actually established a formal code of conduct for clean access. Strict protocols. Then came the really daring expeditions. In February 2012, the Russian team drilling at Vostok finally broke through into the lake. They managed to recover samples of lake water that had refrozen onto the bottom of the ice sheet, what's called accretion ice.
Accretion ice, so frozen lake water.
Exactly. A direct, though frozen, sample. Then, unfortunately, later that same year, in December 2012, a major British expedition aiming for Lake Ellsworth had to be called off because of equipment failure right on the ice. A huge setback.
Oh, that's tough. After all that planning.
It was heartbreaking for them. But then, success came in January 2013. The U.S.-led Wizard expedition successfully drilled into and sampled Lake Whillans in West Antarctica. They were specifically looking for microbial life. And more recently, in December 2018, the SALSA team reached another West Antarctic lake, LakeMercer, collecting both water and sediment samples. Each of these projects was just a monumental undertaking, pushing engineering and logistical limits, all while trying desperately to stick to those clean access rules to preserve these unique ecosystems.
Okay, so once we figured out how to find them and even sample them carefully, the next really mind-bending question has to be, how do these huge bodies of water even stay liquid beneath miles of solid ice? It just seems wrong.
It really does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it comes down to a powerful combination of factors. First, there's geothermal heat, like Kropotkin suggested. Heat flowing up from the Earth's interior provides some warmth from below. It's not a lot, but it helps. But the critical factor is the immense pressure from all that overlying ice. Thousands of meters of ice way down on the water. And just like pressure cookers work, this extreme pressure lowers the freezing point of water.
Ah, so it doesn't freeze at 0 Celsius anymore.
Exactly. For Lake Vostok, for example, the water is actually around -3 degrees Celsius, but it's still liquid because of the pressure. And some lakes can also be hypersaline, very salty. The dissolved salts further depress the freezing point, allowing them to stay liquid at even colder temperatures. What's also pretty intriguing is they can even exist on underwater hillsides, believe it or not, if the ice sheet above provides a strong enough hydrostatic seal to basically trap the water there against gravity.
Wow. Okay, and once scientists confirmed how they existed, the sheer number and the sort of global spread of these lakes, that must have been astonishing too. What did we learn about their scale and distribution?
It really was. We now know of over 400 subglacial lakes globally. The vast majority, yes, are in Antarctica. But we're also finding them under the Greenland ice sheet, under Iceland's big Vatnajökull ice cap, and even under parts of northern Canada. Antarctica really dominates the picture, though. You find clusters of lakes near the ice, divides the high points where the ice flows away in different directions, and increasingly we're finding them near the coast, under fast-flowing ice streams. Lake Vostok, as we mentioned, it's just enormous, 240 kilometers long, maybe 50 wide, roughly the size of Lake Ontario, but hidden under nearly 4 kilometers of ice.
That's hard to even picture.
It is. And if you add up all the estimated water in just the Antarctic subglacial lakes, you're looking at something like 10,000 cubic kilometers of water.
10,000 cubic kilometers. How much is that, really?
It's estimated to be roughly 15% of all of Earth's liquid freshwater. It's a massive, previously completely hidden reservoir.
15%, just under Antarctica.
Just under Antarctica.
Yes.
Regionally, you've got the biggest lakes in East Antarctica, around Dome Sea and Vostok lakes like Concordia, Aurora. Then West Antarctica has Lake Whillans, Ellsworth, Mercer, the ones that have been sampled recently. And interestingly, as glaciers retreat, some former subglacial lakes are becoming exposed at the surface, like Lake Hodgson on the Antarctic Peninsula. Gives us a different kind of window into them. Elsewhere, Greenland has a couple confirmed, likely fed more by surface meltwater draining down rather than basal melt. And that drainage, surprisingly, seems to influence how the ice itself flows. Then you have Iceland, very volcanically active, so you get significant meltwater under glaciers like Vatnajökull. Lakes like Grimsvötn there can drain catastrophically in events called Jokulaups, huge glacial outburst floods. Very dangerous.
Right, I've heard of those sudden floods from under the ice.
Exactly. And finally, under Canada's Devon ice cap, they found two hypersaline lakes, probably isolated for a long time because the water interacted with salt-rich bedrock underneath.
Okay, so these aren't just isolated puddles sitting there. It really sounds like the interaction between these hidden water systems and the huge ice sheets above is, well, far more complex and maybe more influential than anyone thought.
That's one of the biggest takeaways of the last couple of decades, absolutely. We're realizing how much these subglacial water systems influence glacier movement. Essentially, the water can act like a lubricant at the base of the ice. It reduces friction between the ice and the bed beneath it.
Making the ice slide more easily.
Precisely. Enhancing basal ice motion, which can lead to accelerated ice flow. There was a documented case where a 10% speedup of Bird Glacier, a major outlet glacier in East Antarctica, was directly linked to a large subglacial water drainage event upstream. And it highlights how interconnected these systems are. The lakes often aren't isolated. They're linked by subglacial rivers and streams, forming these dynamic drainage networks. Water can flow from one lake to another or eventually find its way out to the ocean beneath the ice shelves. It completely changes how we need to model ice sheet dynamics and predict future changes.
Right. Okay, so we know how they form, where they are, and that they affect the ice. Now, for what I think is the most fascinating part, the life, what did scientists actually find down there in those extreme isolated worlds?
Yeah, this is where it gets truly mind-boggling. Because despite the conditions, think about it, near freezing or below freezing temperatures, total darkness, immense pressure, very low nutrient levels, these subglacial lakes are not sterile, not at all. They harbor thousands of different microbial species. It completely shattered the initial assumption that they'd be lifeless deserts. Professor John Priscu, who's done a lot of work on this, he actually called Antarctica's subglacial ecosystems our planet's largest wetland, which is an amazing image.
A wetland under the ice. So how does life survive without sunlight? What do they eat?
Right, no sunlight means no photosynthesis, the base of most food webs we know. So instead, these ecosystems are driven primarily by chemosynthesis. This means microbes get their energy not from light, but from chemical reactions. They utilize inorganic elements weathered from the rocks and sediments below the ice, things like sulfide, iron, maybe ammonia, carbonates. These amazing microbes called chemolithoautotrophs. It's a mouthful, but it means rock-eating self-feeders using chemicals they form the base of the food web.
Okay, so they make their own food from rocks and chemicals.
Basically, yes. And then other microbes, heterotrophs, can consume the organic matter produced by these primary producers or consume other microbes. So you get a whole food web structure just based on chemistry instead of light. Nutrient cycling is also really unique down there. For example, oxygen. Where does that come from in a sealed environment?
Good question.
It turns out that air bubbles trapped in the glacial ice as it formed, these things called air clathrates, release oxygen as the ice melts at the lake interface. This can create relatively oxygen-rich or oxic upper layers in the lakes, but deeper down, or in the sediments, microbial respiration can use up that oxygen, leading to anoxic or oxygen-free conditions. Other nutrients like iron, nitrogen, phosphorus, they get released from the slow weathering of the underlying bedrock and sediments by the water, and also from the melting glacial ice itself. And what's also fascinating is the outflow. When this subglacial water eventually reaches the ocean, it carries significant amounts of dissolved solutes like silica and iron. The contribution is actually comparable to major world rivers for some elements.
Wow, so they're actively fertilizing parts of the Southern Ocean.
It seems likely, yeah. And one more thing, carbon. Underneath the Antarctic ice, particularly in sedimentary basins, there's an estimated 21,000 petagrams of organic carbon locked away.
21,000 petagrams. How much is that?
That's more than 10 times the amount of carbon estimated to be stored in Arctic permafrost. It's a colossal amount.
Whoa.
It makes these subglacial environments a really crucial, but still very poorly understood, part of the global carbon cycle. And this buried organic carbon can lead to methane production by microbes in the anoxic sediments. Now, most of that methane seems to be consumed by other bacteria in the oxygenated water layers before it can escape.
But if the ice sheets were to destabilize?
Exactly. There's a potential feedback loop there. If large parts of the ice sheets were to collapse, this trapped methane could potentially be released into the atmosphere, which is a potent greenhouse gas.
That's incredible. Entire ecosystems running on chemistry, cycling nutrients, storing vast amounts of carbon. So what specific kinds of life have we actually managed to identify in the samples they've retrieved? Any surprises?
Oh, plenty of surprises. The actual discoveries are truly eye-opening. Take Lake Whillans, the first one successfully sampled by the Wizard team. Their samples showed something like 130,000 microbial cells per milliliter of water. That's a lot of life. And they identified nearly 4,000 different bacterial species. And importantly, these microbes were active, metabolizing things like ammonia, methane, and sulphur compounds found in the water.
So definitely not dormant, but actively living.
Definitely active. Yeah. Then at LakeMercer, sampled by the Celsa team, they found similar bacterial densities, around 10,000 cells per milliliter. But they also found, well, remnants of larger organisms, things like diatom shells, tiny photosynthetic algae, suggesting maybe the area was open water in the past, but also remarkably well-preserved carcasses of tiny crustaceans like little shrimp and even a
A
tardigrade.
tardigrade, a water bear down there.
A water bear. Those incredibly resilient microscopic animals. Finding their remains, and the crustaceans, strongly suggests that maybe, just maybe, there could be more complex animal life, not just microbes, surviving down there today, or at least that the environment supported them relatively recently.
That is genuinely mind-blowing. What about Lake Vostok, the biggest one?
Vostok is trickier because the only samples are from that accretion ice, the refrozen stuff, and there were some concerns about potential contamination from the drilling fluid used. However, analyses of that ice did reveal evidence of actively growing bacteria and thousands of unique DNA sequences belonging to bacteria, archaea, and even eukaryotes, more complex cells. Some sequences were related to things we know from freshwater environments, like Daphnia, water fleas, to tardigrades again, even mollusks and fungi. The interpretation is still debated because of the contamination question, but it hints at a potentially diverse ecosystem.
So tantalizing hints, even if not fully confirmed yet.
Exactly. And it's not just the big lakes. Under Taylor Glacier, there's this outflow called blood falls, looks like flowing blood, because it's rich in iron oxide. That water comes from a subglacial pool that's been sealed off for maybe 1.5 to 2 million years. It's anoxic, hypersaline, and the microbial community discovered there uses this really novel metabolic strategy involving sulfate and dissolved iron ions. It's like a window into ancient life.
2 million years sealed off. Incredible.
And even in Iceland, under the glaciers there, researchers have found active, cold-loving, or psychrophilic bacteria. Some are autotrophs, making their own food, including species like Geobacter and the Sulfosporosinus that use sulfur and iron compounds for anaerobic respiration, breathing without oxygen.
So life finds a way, even in these incredibly harsh, diverse subglacial settings. You mentioned the isolation. Does that make these lakes sort of unique time capsules for understanding Earth's past, or maybe even life beyond Earth?
That's a really crucial aspect, yes. The isolation is key. Some of these subglacial water bodies, especially the deeper, slower-moving ones like perhaps parts of Vostok, might have been sealed off from the surface world for millions of years. They could potentially harbor evolutionarily distinct microbial communities, living fossils almost, surviving in what some call fossil waters. Studying them could give us profound clues about how life might have survived extreme climate events in Earth's past, like the hypothetical snowball Earth periods, when much of the planet might have been covered in ice.
Like a refuge under the ice.
Exactly, a deep biosphere refuge. And then, yes, connecting this to the bigger picture, subglacial lakes here on Earth are considered prime analog environments for icy bodies elsewhere in our solar system. We strongly suspect Jupiter's moon, the Europa, and Saturn's moon, Enceladus, have vast liquid water oceans hidden beneath their icy crusts. The conditions there, as darkness, high pressure, potential chemical energy from interaction with a rocky core, sound remarkably similar to Earth's subglacial lakes.
So finding life here makes it seem more plausible out there.
It dramatically increases the plausibility, yes. Discovering diverse, thriving ecosystems based on chemosynthesis right here, in environments we once thought were sterile, it strongly suggests that life could potentially exist in similar conditions elsewhere. It really expands our definition of what constitutes a habitable zone. And just to really drive that home, in 2018, radar evidence confirmed the existence of a stable body of liquid water, a subglacial lake, beneath the south polar ice cap of Mars.
Mars, too. Okay, the implications just keep growing. This deep dive isn't just about history, though. We're also looking at brand new insights. What's the absolute latest research telling us? Are we still finding new things?
Oh, absolutely. The exploration is far from over. A really significant recent study, this was by Napoleoni and colleagues in 2020, took another look at West Antarctica, specifically the Ellsworth Subglacial Highlands. They analyzed a huge amount of airborne ice-penetrating radar data, much more detailed than previous surveys. And using sophisticated analysis techniques, they identified 33 previously uncharted subglacial lakes in that one region alone.
33 new lakes. Just like that.
Just like that. It represented something like a 40% increase in the known number of lakes in all of West Antarctica. It shows how much might still be hidden. They used advanced methods, looking closely at the bed reflection power, basically how strongly the radar signal bounced off the bottom, and also something called specularity, which indicates how smooth and mirror-like that reflecting surface is.
And water gives that mirror-like
Yeah,
reflection.
exactly. Water gives a very strong, very specular reflection compared to rock or bumpy sediments. This allowed them to classify these new detections with varying degrees of confidence. Some were definite lakes, others were maybe dimmer or fuzzier, suggesting different conditions, perhaps shallower water or different sediment types beneath.
So this new data isn't just about adding more dots on the map. It sounds like it's giving a much higher resolution picture of what the landscape under the ice actually looks like and how water might move through it.
Precisely. That's the other crucial part of that study. The new radar data allowed them to create a much improved digital elevation model, a better map of the subglacial bed topography. And this revealed features that weren't clearly seen before, like deep linear troughs, they name them the Ellsworth Trough and the CEC's Trough. These channels and valleys under the ice obviously play a huge role in directing water flow. But here's where it got particularly compelling and maybe a bit unexpected. They modeled the subglacial water catchments, basically, where the water feeding into major glaciers like Pine Island Glacier or Pig and Thwaites Glacier is likely coming from.
The really big, fast-moving, worrying ones in West Antarctica.
Those exact ones.
Yeah.
And what their model showed was that the subglacial water catchments for these glaciers do not precisely match their surface ice catchments, the area of ice that visibly flows into them.
Wait, how does that work? The water underneath flows differently from the ice on top.
Apparently so, in some cases. Specifically, their model suggested that the hydrological catchment feeding Thwaites Glacier from beneath is actually larger than previously thought. It seems to be capturing basal meltwater that originates in the upper reaches of the neighboring Pine Island Glacier's surface catchment.
So Thwaites is getting extra water piped in from underneath, from Pine Island's area.
That's what the model suggests, yeah. Which means potentially more water than expected is draining through the Thwaites Glacier subglacial system. And more water could mean more lubrication at the bed.
Affecting its stability and speed.
Potentially affecting its dynamics, exactly. Which is obviously a major concern given Thwaites' sensitivity to climate change.
So what does this all really mean for us, for understanding the bigger picture? It sounds like this hidden plumbing system beneath the ice might be an even bigger player in ice sheet stability than we realized.
It absolutely points in that direction. Most of these newly identified lakes, the 33 new ones, were found in areas where the ice flows relatively slowly and the ice surface is quite flat, often near those ice divides we mentioned earlier. This suggests these specific conditions, slow flow, low slope, allow meltwater to pond and accumulate, forming lakes. They act as reservoirs. But the connections between them and how they ultimately drain towards the faster flowing ice streams like Thwaites, that's the crucial link. So understanding these hidden subglacial connections, mapping the actual water flow paths, not just assuming they follow the surface ice divides, is becoming absolutely critical if we want to accurately predict how the West Antarctic ice sheet and potentially other ice sheets will behave in a warming climate, especially for those fast-flowing ice streams that are most vulnerable.
It really makes you wonder how many more crucial details are still hidden down there, influencing things on a massive scale. What an incredible journey we've taken deep beneath the ice. From Peter Kropotkin's, initial hunches almost 150 years ago, through seismic surveys, radar, satellites, and finally that incredibly difficult deep drilling. Our understanding of these subglacial worlds has just exploded. We've gone from thinking it was barren rock down there to discovering entire ecosystems, thriving in conditions we once thought were impossible for life, all driven by chemistry instead of sunlight.
And now, with this latest research revealing potentially dozens more hidden lakes and these really complex dynamic water systems that seem to defy our surface-level assumptions about how ice and water should flow, it really does leave you wondering, doesn't it? What other fundamental planetary processes, currently hidden deep beneath ice or earth or ocean, are actively shaping our planet's future in ways we haven't even conceived of yet?
Yeah. These deep dives into the unknown, they don't just expand our knowledge of Earth, do they? They really fuel our imagination about where else life might be hiding out there in the vastness of space. As we keep pushing the boundaries, exploring these extreme environments, it feels like we're not just finding new lakes or strange microbes, we're fundamentally redefining the very limits of where life itself can exist. So, what part of this deep dive stood out most to you? We invite you to think about that and maybe consider what other hidden systems, what unseen connections might be operating right under our noses, just waiting for us to figure out how to look for them.